Wonderful. Welcome again officially to this policy forum on resilient social contracts and sustaining peace. We are looking these days for ways and pathways, it has now become a set phrase, for how to prevent conflict and to sustain peace. And the purpose of this event is to explore to what extent social contracting or social contracts could be a pathway to not only preventing conflict but sustaining peace. And we have assembled for you, as you can see, a distinguished panel. But before I give the floor to our panelists and introduce them to you, it's my pleasure to introduce our co-sponsors who really helped us make this possible. And without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to our UNDP co-sponsor, represented here by our eminent colleague Endre Stiansen, who is a senior advisor for research and policy at the Oslo Governance Center. Please, Endre.
Thanks. It's my great pleasure to be here and to speak on behalf of Patrick Koulos, who is the director of the UNDP's BPPS. Also, I bring greetings from the director of OGC, Sarah Lister, who couldn't be here today, so you're stuck with me. I just want to explain a little bit about why UNDP, Oslo Governance Center, supported this project. As you know, all of you are familiar with the mandate of UNDP: promote, good governance, promote development, and especially now within the guidance of the trajectories of SDG 16. OGC is one of 5 global policy centers for UNDP, and we are specifically working on issues relating to transitions, out of conflict, out of crisis, out of war, but also now increasingly looking at prevention. We are then meant to work with research and feed research insights into policy processes, and then with a view to improve programming. So this then is a very, very good project for us, because it's very much research-based, yet it's also very practical in the sense that it comes up with policy recommendations, and it will then hopefully over time lead to better programming in the field where that is necessary. The choice of topic, social contract, we think is very opportune, very right, because it's something about bringing the whole of society approach to the challenges that we face in the field now. It is broader than, say, social cohesion work. It is broader than political settlement, yet it is identifying absolutely key processes. It has a political dimension, it has an economic dimension, it has a social dimension. It talks about the legitimacy of the state, it talks about security. It brings everything together, and it's a very dynamic concept. So to looking at that, using that as a frame, we believe is very, very useful for development organizations such as UNDP, and we have therefore invested in this project, and we are now very keen for the next phase, which is more the operationalize it. I'm not going to go into the details of the project because that will be explained by others. But I think there's one takeaway from this that I want to give to you, and that is the dynamic nature of the concept. It is something that we can use in our daily work to understand better why a society is not able to get out of crisis. What are the obstacles, but also what are the positive drivers to be able to reach the goals that we have set for ourselves in SDG 16, which are peaceful, inclusive, democratic systems of governments throughout the world. So without further ado, I'll leave the floor.
Thank you very much, Yusuf. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung New York office, the distinguished panelists, the moderator, as well as you all in the audience. I would like to tell you very briefly what and who the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung is. It's the oldest political foundation in Germany with a rich tradition in social democracy dating back to its inception in 1925. It was founded as a political legacy of Friedrich Ebert, the first democratically elected president of Germany, and banned shortly afterwards by the Nazis. Re-established in 1948, Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung is now a publicly funded non-profit institution with more than 600 employees, which organizes its work autonomously and independently. Its educational and policy-oriented activities address both the German public and expert communities throughout our offices in Germany, as well as the international audience with our offices worldwide, predominantly in the Global South. In its international work today, FES supports policies for peaceful cooperation and human rights, promotes the establishment and consolidation of democratic, social, and constitutional structures, and is a pioneer for free trade unions and strong civil society. The work of FES focuses on the core ideas and values of social democracy, freedom, justice, and solidarity. With offices in more than 100 countries, FES is regularly in touch with a large, yet very unique, diverse, and vibrant community of people, partners, and friends. Among them are policymakers, young leaders, trade unionists, opinion leaders, researchers, and media practitioners in Africa, the Americas, Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. In many countries, our work and that of our partners is very much related to the question that was also at the outset of this research project, the societal relationships and domestic peace, how to support the development of a resilient national social contract. We were therefore very pleased to help bring about the Research and Policy Dialogue project by Erin McCandles. It was an enormously ambitious project, you will hear more about it, examining in great detail the conflict situations, patterns, and structures in 11 countries. It provides us with a rich comparative analysis, which is, I think, something very special, of conflicts and peace-building efforts. And it applies a new lens or suggests a new tool to conflicts, the social contract. Acknowledging that sustainable peace is never a technical matter only, it in fact is deeply societal and political, the study highlights the need for inclusive peace agreements and the importance of vibrant societal relations. To us, it seems that the social contexts are a useful, heuristic, and normative policy tool to understand conflicts, to forge a common vision, and to create new relationships and institutions. Social contracts as relationships among citizens, as between citizens or civil society organizations with governmental institutions, need to be nursed, nurtured, and renewed on a regular basis through policy dialogues, public debates, and national conversations. This is true for all countries worldwide, reflecting also and sort of responding to the ambitions and the scope of the 2030 Agenda, particularly the Sustainable Development Goal 16, but also 10 and many others, I guess, or I think. Peace being a genuinely political matter, it's important to build strong democratic institutions. And we think of parliaments, parties, trade unions, civil societies, traditional as well as more recent ones, with vibrant relations among each other to weave a resilient societal pattern. Social contract, it seems, can be seen as the much-needed mechanism for inclusiveness and national ownership for peace-sustaining processes. So we do hope that the enormous wealth of information and analysis provided by the research project headed by Erin McCandles will spur and support the search for resilient solutions for sustaining peace in all countries. I would like to thank all our partners, UNDP, the Oslo Governance Center, and the Julian J. Studley Fund of the Graduate Program of International Affairs of the New School, as well as our co-sponsors for this event today, the Mission of Japan, and our hosts here at IPI. And I look forward to what will be unquestionably a thought-provoking debate today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It is a great pleasure for the Permanent Mission of Japan to the United Nations to be co-hosting this event. And thank you to all the speakers, all the participants, and the other co-hosts we have a huge crowd here. Japan has consistently prioritized peace building, sustaining peace, And in that, we have stressed institution building and human security. Human security is about making sure that the individuals are satisfied about their various securities. And I think the theme today, forging resilient social contracts, overlaps with Japan's stress and priority. So that is why we decided to co-sponsor this very important event. Japan in the Security Council has been active in peace building. We have organized an open debate on African peace building in 2016. And outside of the Security Council, we are active in the Peace Building Commission. We are taking the lead on institution building. Before that, we were taking the lead on lessons learned. So today, I hope that we can all hear from good presentations from the speakers and take back a lot of lessons which will be useful to all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Very good to be here, to see so many familiar faces, and to have this opportunity to speak on really what is a very critical theme. I'd like to thank IPI for convening this event, for the sponsors for supporting it, and for Yusuf for so ably presiding over it. I want to share some brief remarks on how we see these themes from the perspective of the UN and from the SG's office in particular. I think there's a growing awareness that the issues of inclusion, resilience, and building them into our preventive activities are absolutely critical to sustaining peace where peace already exists, to furthering peace where conflict is prevailing, and to re-establishing peace where a peace agreement has been or is about to be signed. These are really the issues of our times. The truth is, though, that much as recent studies have shown how important this is, we're really not very good at it. And I think the first step in improving is recognizing that there's a big discrepancy between the rhetoric out there, the learning, and what we're actually doing on the ground. I think a number of groundbreaking studies, and I would highlight, in addition to the one we're discussing today, the study done jointly by the World Bank and the UN, Pathways for Peace, have all come to the same conclusions on what the correct approach is. And I would agree with the representative of Japan that in many ways that approach was pre-echoed by the human security approach that Japan was so active, has been so active in promoting. I mean, this particular study breaks up the challenge in three pillars: inclusive political settlements, institutions that deliver results and deliver results inclusively, and social cohesion. But in describing the solutions, they also describe what is at the heart of the problem and what we really don't do very well. And I think part of that is also how we're structured. If you think of the themes that we're talking about, prevention, resilience, social cohesion, inclusive political settlement, strong institutions, that doesn't conform naturally with any single institution in the UN system, or naturally with how our mandates are broken up. The whole theme of inclusion, arguably, is at the heart of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Inclusion is in essence about non-discrimination. It's in essence about bringing in those who otherwise are being excluded socially, excluded economically, excluded politically, often persecuted. It's about upholding rights. But the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has barely any role in, or barely any capacity or funding when it comes to strengthening national institutions. And its national institution work tends to focus on institutions focused on human rights, rather than those, and I think this is at the heart of this study, that actually deliver services. Because the issue is delivery of health services, water services, the frontline ministries doing so inclusively. And the UN agencies that would deal with those entities don't necessarily have fully integrated, this depends to degree, and this point is perhaps one some would dispute, the whole inclusion agenda. I mean, I'm not sure to what extent, when there are analyses of water and irrigation systems in a country by a UN entity that is taking the lead in that. In the distant past, UNICEF had a very strong role in that. I think it's come away a bit from the water sector. But to what extent the issue of inclusion is looked at in terms of strengthening national institutions. And so the inclusion debate and the institutional capacity building debate are not necessarily brought together systematically in the way our agencies operate. And then, of course, you have the division between the humanitarian and the development. The development actors will more naturally incline towards building up national institutions, though not always with a strong human rights focus. The humanitarian actors will tend more to, certainly in the emergency phase, to surrogate for the absence of those structures and not necessarily have that focus on national institution building, which we all agree is key to sustainable peace. So that's the system we have, and it doesn't adapt naturally or easily around the pursuit of these objectives. Having said that, I think it can be done. I think in the field you can often bring the system together to rally around these objectives. And often you have, not always, but often you will have counterparts, government counterparts, who are very conducive to that idea. I had the honor of being the resident coordinator for 3 years in Colombia. And Colombia, I think, in a way, is both a test case and an illustration of the validity, but also the constraints of this approach. You had in Colombia an inclusive political settlement. That there is perhaps no political settlement in the world, peace process in the world, that it goes so much to the root causes of the conflict. It is built on rural development in areas where rural development wasn't happening. It's built on substitution of the illicit economies, mainly drug economies, which was at the heart of the conflict. It's built around political participation. It's built around victims' rights, the key issues that were motivating the conflict. You have in Colombia strong national institutions that tend to have a fairly inclusive approach. The problem was, however, that this very, or the challenge, I should say, rather than the problem, that this very ambitious and appropriate peace agreement is very hard to deliver on, because the strong national institutions you have at a very essential level in the places where the conflict was being fought, and more in Colombia through the advances of the military, the conflict had been pushed to the margins. Those institutions that were strong at the national level were all but lacking. And it was very difficult it wasn't a question of reconstruction or bringing those institutions back. It was about putting them there in the first place. And that was a massive undertaking in a place that also has an extremely difficult geography and a lack of infrastructure. But it's a high middle income country. So you can imagine the challenges, if they were so difficult in Colombia, how they would be in a place where I served subsequently, the Central African Republic, which is really at the bottom of all the development indices. So even where you have a strong, inclusive peace agreement, strong institutions at a national level, it can be a formidable challenge to bring that to the local level where the conflict is usually unfolding. And that's even more of a challenge in countries that don't enjoy, even at a national level, such institutions. And then the third element of this pillar is the issue of social cohesion. And I'd like to say 2 words about that, because if conflict does one thing, is it breaks apart social cohesion. One of the first conflicts I was exposed to in my career was in Croatia in the early 90s. I was 10 years old at the time. I'm not as old as I look. I was young at the time, not quite that young. But there was a famous quote of a resident of Vukovar. Vukovar was one of the cities on the border with Serbia that was most destroyed in the war of Croatia. At the end of that war, it was totally, the devastation was awful and the killing was awful. And a resident of Vukovar famously said, before the war, none of us knew who was a Croat and a Serb. Now there's nobody left to ask. And that, shows the devastation of war and how war in Bosnia and elsewhere led to this self-identification that in large parts of the former Yugoslavia was really not there, but it was created by an irresponsible political leadership who used the politics of fear and the politics of identity to promote a war agenda and a power agenda. And it became self-consciousness. And that tore the social fabric apart. It tore it apart in ways that are very difficult to overcome. And that's even more difficult the longer the conflict lasted. I was talking yesterday to our representative in Kosovo, and I asked him how returns were going. Serb returns to Kosovo after the 1999 conflict there. He told me this year there had been 3 returns. So that's however many years after the conflict, 15 years, 18 years after the conflict, a conflict that was very short in duration, and still Serbs and non-Kosovo Albanians don't feel it's safe to come back. So that shows how this fabric, even in a relatively short war, but with a long history, arguably, of discrimination and low-level conflict, can be ripped apart. In Colombia, I witnessed it. There you had, depending who you talk to, 60, 70 years of conflict. Of course, it wasn't ethnic. It wasn't religious. Like in some of the other conflicts I've returned to. But it was very much about left and right, and it was very much about those associated with guerrilla groups. It was very much about the disadvantaged. It was very much about rural, urban, and the stigmatization persisted. And it's really very, very difficult to overcome. And one thing I'm completely convinced of, I think there are many areas where we talk of the importance of bottom-up approaches, where we talk of the importance of grassroots developments, of getting communities together. But one thing I'm convinced of is that when it comes to reconciliation and social cohesion, first of all, reconciliation can't happen without the justice component. And that's been a big issue in Kosovo and in the Balkans. It's very difficult to ask people to reconcile if they don't see the war criminals among the other community held to account. So I don't think you can isolate social cohesion, for example, from justice. I think you have to look at it together. But that's back to strong national institutions. But I was coming back to what it takes for reconciliation and social cohesion to work. And there, I think no end of grassroots projects can substitute for leaders with powerful symptoms of reconciliation. I think the Middle East is a good example of this. I don't know how many Palestine-Israeli cross-border groups, theater groups, dance groups, etc., they are. And the more they're created, the more the general tendency goes in the opposite direction. And that's because the leadership is promoting a very, very different message. And if you think about the major examples of national reconciliation, of building of social cohesion that have been successfully undertaken, and I'm thinking, for example, of South Africa, it was very much about the leaders who had been at war with one another, falling into one another's arms, embracing one another, shaking hands, doing highly symbolic acts of reconciliation. And I think that, in a sense, in Colombia came late or was lacking, which is also one explanation, arguably, for the failed referendum, which was in itself an illustration of a deficit in social cohesion and reconciliation. So I think the role of leaders, in particular in this idea of promoting social cohesion, is absolutely fundamental, but often difficult to achieve. Now, just in conclusion, I'd like to say, I made the point that we're not well geared to do this from an institutional point of view, but it is very much part of the reform agenda. I mean, that we can't start from nothing, get rid of all the existing institutions and rebuild ourselves up around this agenda, which perhaps would be the ideal. But as part of the reform, there is certainly an effort to try and gear the system better, to work more together, more cohesively, more coherently around these specific agenda points in advance of conflict, in anticipation of potential conflict, during conflict, and in the aftermath of conflict. But of course, it's what we realize, it's not, the UN on its own will not get very far. It's really for member states, for regional organizations, for civil society to join better up. And I think to join better up, we need a vision. And I think the sort of work that's being done is tremendously important in contributing to that uniting vision, which is the first step to improving our practice and making a much bigger progress in making a difference who suffer most from the deficit of peace, development, and human rights. Many thanks.
Thank you very much. I think we've had a very good series of introductory remarks. I'm just going to pick 3 points, and that will substitute for what my script says, introduce the subject. I won't. But I think 3 important elements that came from these very good intervention. One is, if you want to promote governance for peace, you better anchor it in research. Second, social contracting is about domestic peace. It's not something we often hear. It's about relations. Peace is about relations among citizens, but also between citizens and the states. And the framework. We were reminded of the framework of the human security, where individual is both the beneficiary and the conduit to human security. I think the last point that struck me, and I hope we can reflect on it as a panel, is the importance of leadership. Fundamental, as a catalyst for connecting the bottom to the top through the middle. So that's what I gained from these very helpful remarks. And so without further ado, it's my pleasure now to get to the meat of our program, which is going to be case study based, except for the first presentation by Dr. Erin McCandless. You have the bio of our distinguished panel before you on the blue sheet. After Dr. McCandless, we'll give the floor to Dr. Loco Cole, who is our, I must say, Erin is our leader in this particular project. She got me involved in it, kicking and screaming. You will hear me do so later. And then after Dr. Cole, we have Dr. Yasmin Ramovic. We should give him Tunisian citizen because Yasmin is our country's flower, who is a lecturer in peace and conflict studies. And I will, with your indulgence, come in as a co-author of the case study on Tunisia at the end to share with you our take of how forging a resilient social contract in Tunisia and it's linked to sustaining peace. I wrenched a commitment from each of the speakers not to take the floor more than 10 minutes, except with Dr. McCandless, because she's going to give us the overview. I've given her 2 additional minutes from my time, and I'm going to see to it that she sticks to overview. So without further ado, therefore, it's my pleasure to give you the floor, Erin.
Thank you so much. And first, just to express my gratitude to my co-authors in this work and our partners, UNDP, FES, and newly Japanese supporting this hosting event. Thank you so much, and IPI as well for the lots of hard work in preparing this. I don't think I have to do very much because the ASG did such an astounding job of describing the project, but of course I still will try to hit on some key points. We've worked very hard to get to this point, and so it's really a great honor to be here and to be sharing our findings with you. First, I'll say a little bit about the context of this work and then touch upon some of our key findings and speak a little bit about the importance of the policy context that the findings are contributing to, and just a brief touch on our next steps. So the context, why is this topic important? And I think several of our opening remarks have expressed important aspects of this. I think we need to also recognize the complexity of the conflict environment with persistent and recurring conflict, very intractable and spiking conflict over the last 10 years as well, intermixing with high levels of fragility and violence in ever more complex ways. So this all points to the enormous challenges for states and societies and international community in trying to address and find durable solutions to the challenges. There's been 3 key areas that have been critiqued over the last 10 years at least, perhaps more. First around, of course, this notion of elite political settlements that are just simply not sustainable. And secondly, around our approaches to peace building, which have been critiqued quite widely for being not sufficiently context sensitive, a little too focused on templating Western institutions and ideas and not really getting at the root causes of conflict. Similarly, state building approaches have been too technically focused and around building institutions and without really understanding the necessary state-society relationships underpinning and driving the success of institutions. So all of these have pointed quite clearly in the direction of the need for greater focus on building state-society relations, strengthening these relations, and really creating a more accountable, durable sovereignty. And of course, these are key notions underpinning the social contract. So our research, as several have noted, has been on 11 countries, not easy, very challenging, interesting, intriguing cases. And I constantly joke that my biggest mistake was in choosing such amazing authors. They're incredibly busy and incredibly difficult to forge, to keep focused in the right direction. And we are investigating this question of what drives a resilient social contract. And of course, what is the social contract? Our familiar understanding is probably the classical Western tradition of, forfeiting some rights for the achievement of others. And this is, of course, a utilitarian decision of citizens. Well, that may not be the case everywhere, clearly. Yet, we have looked much more historically before the classical era and found enduring themes that kind of cut across different civilizations and across the globe, and see that questions of what is the purpose of such agreements and who is it between and what mechanisms drive social contracts and what how do people address with their leaders questions of moral obligation and conflicting interests. So these issues really transcend what is often critiqued as liberal understanding of the social contract. So our research again is on this notion of a resilient social contract, and of course this is important for countries affected by conflict and fragility, but it's also truly important in the United States of America, in Sweden, and so forth, as we know. And so a resilient social contract is one, again, that has this dynamism that can respond and react to effectively to shocks and stressors, and how it can peacefully mediate agreements around how to manage different notions of rights and responsibilities through various mechanisms and processes. So our research has investigated and confirmed that 3 drivers of the social contract are particularly important, and the ASG nicely outlined them, so I don't need to go deeply into this. But basically we have the inclusive political settlements addressing core issues of conflict, and secondly, increasingly effective and inclusive institutions that are delivering inclusive results, especially in the area of economics and social service realms. And then thirdly, around broadening and deepening social cohesion, both horizontally between groups and citizens in society, and also vertically between citizens groups and the state. And we've also looked at a number of cross-cutting issues, as if this weren't complex enough, looking at the role of inclusion and exclusion, and this notion of resilience capacities that drive and support peace, as well as state formation processes and how this influences the nature of the social contract. And lastly, the role of international actors. And all of this, thinking about how does this support sustaining peace. So moving specifically to some key findings. First is around the notion of inclusion. And of course, we've seen this as a very key issue brought up repeatedly, and an emerging consensus, a pretty strong consensus in the policy realm around the importance of inclusion for sustaining peace. And certainly our research did confirm that, and especially in the early stages of peace processes, where peace agreements provide, increase the parameters for inclusion of groups and political parties in ways that are very important, but they're very difficult to maintain and sustain, right? And so this is because, for reasons, for example, that informal agreements undermine the formal agreements, as we see in the case of Zimbabwe and Yemen, or it can be because of the development of separate ethno-nationalist institutions, as we see in the case of Bosnia, in particular Bosnia and Herzegovina, and also where power sharing may start off well, but is undermined eventually by elite entrenched interests, as we see in the case of South Sudan. And Luca will tell us about this. And so our findings point in particular to 2 very compelling reasons why why political settlements fail to transition into more inclusive and resilient social contracts. And the first is around this notion of core issues of conflict, core conflict issues we call them, and they're not being effectively addressed over time and through different political settlements. And thus they build into very protracted, unresolvable social conflict. And for us, core conflict issues are a departure from this current widespread interest on grievances, which core conflict issues are about where state and society, where there's wide agreement that these issues are really important, and we've seen them over time in the policy discourse, and they serve in a way as a way to assess how well state and society is doing at resolving conflict. And second reason why the failure to transition into more inclusive social contracts is that social contract making mechanisms, the institutional structures, state and non-state and customary, that can serve as means to address these core issues of conflict are not effectively treated in coherent ways in the peace process and through different mechanisms and policies that follow the peace agreement. Right, so for example, this can occur when follow-on agreements do not effectively build upon what was agreed in the peace agreement. We see this, for example, in South Africa, where original agreements with the ANC around the Freedom Charter really presented what people wanted and desired and expected, but they were progressively undermined by policies that followed. And even though we just heard the SG speak about the importance of leadership in bringing about reconciliation, it's these material gains that were expected by society as part of the agreement need also to be fulfilled for the peace to really be worth sustaining, let's put it that way. So secondly, formal governance institutions, like especially through devolution and decentralization, commitments that were made around this in the peace agreement are not effectively realized. And this is common across most, if not all, of our cases. And oftentimes this occurs with respect to customary and informal institutions that have very strong, that resonate very strongly with large parts of society, and they're not effectively engaged or considered in the peace process. And we have a typology that we developed to look at this notion of mechanisms of social contracting, and just to see how core conflict issues are addressed through different spheres, so that it's not just left at the level of the peace agreement. You can see it goes through peacemaking, transitional governance, official and even hybrid systems of governance, and then the importance of the everyday. So how do people and citizens at the local level in particular mediate and build agreements around what matters for them? And that serves as a litmus test to tell us how well the peace agreement actually is addressing the issues. So our third driver, as the ASG was speaking about on social cohesion, one of the key findings there is that vertical and horizontal cohesion are very linked in important ways, and they need to be addressed in integrated ways. So horizontal between groups, vertical between state and society, they interact. And for example, vertical cohesion is very weak where the political settlement has not effectively addressed these core issues of conflict, or where institutions are not delivering. I mean, this is not rocket science, but there's many nuances that we really need to understand in terms of how social cohesion works at different levels, and our study offers some very intriguing insights into that. Other important findings around how legitimacy functions. This is a big issue right now, especially related to delivery of services. And our findings really show that state legitimacy is supported or undermined by expectations around service provision, corruption, participation, and especially delivery of promises made by the state. And where these aren't kept, we see protests. Protests are a great barometer of the health of the social contract. And across all of our cases, we have protests and dealt with by the state in different ways. I mean, that's also part of the barometer, right? How well the state deals with protest. The roles of international actors. And again, as the ASG said, we need to do more work in this area to understand and to really ensure that international actors are supporting conflict sensitivity, supporting institutions in ways that address conflict, and also not supporting agreements that unwittingly end up driving further conflict. And then also the challenges of turning inclusive processes into inclusive results. And this is quite a wide terrain, and we have many very interesting examples of this. But they all sort of illustrate why and how a focus on building inclusion through these different mechanisms and institutional arrangements is so key to be able to ensure inclusive results. So finding on sustaining peace, how does all of this contribute to sustaining peace? And of course, in addition to the three drivers that each are important, what's even more important is how they interact in mutually reinforcing ways and are catalytically, supporting each other towards more peace. They can also devolve in very unvirtuous ways. Secondly is around how resilience capacities are mobilized and supported in the interests of the peace agreement. And third is around how parallel systems and structures within society are dealt with and brought into and harmonized with the larger national social contract. And I think our authors will tell more on this. So lastly, almost lastly, policy relevance. And the new policy agendas, which have been alluded to, but of course the Agenda 2030, which has brought peaceful and inclusive societies into the development framework, and the General Assembly and Security Council resolutions on sustaining peace and conflict prevention, all really highlight the importance of a national vision, the need to have a national vision and to address root causes of conflict. And the recent high-level meetings in April on sustaining peace illustrated member states' wide commitment to these causes, but at the same time still illustrated some concern around the how. How will this happen? And here's where we think we really have something to offer. The social contract is, of course, an inclusive concept that frames the national vision with a broad appeal. And our work, we feel, offers a theory of change in three ways. First, by making political settlements more inclusive, and overcoming political obstacles by embedding agreements in institutional arrangements and in efforts to deepen and strengthen relationships. And secondly, by charting a pathway to address intractable issues of conflict that matter to people in transparent, participatory, and results-focused ways. And third, by offering an integrated, context-centered treatment of peace and security, development, and politics. So lastly, just in terms of our next steps, all of us need to multiply these conversations because they are important everywhere. A social contract is important in every country and around the world, of course. And I'm very excited to be moving to South Africa in my new institutional home of WITS, where they're taking this issue very seriously. And even the president, Ramaphosa's agenda has social contract right at the heart of it. And so and also society does. So it's a discourse that resonates both at the political level and with society. And I know my colleagues there are planning discussions with the Scandinavians, trying to bring the Scandinavians together to say, help us understand, and we can probably teach you too. So lastly, I think our research will be delving deeper into some of these challenging issues, like how to mediate the many different social contracts that might exist in a particular context. And in particular, inclusion is a cross-cutting issue. And finally, how we assess the social contracts. So that's going to be a big part of what we look at. How do we assess it in order to better support policy and programming at national level? And we hope you'll join us in these challenging efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron, for this excellent overview and for sharing with us what makes a social contract a resilient one and the various components and drivers underpinning it, and more importantly, the challenges that are encountered in making it work. And particularly, thank you for also reminding us there are so many processes that are aiming for inclusion and sustainability, and yet we are struggling with the how. And so perhaps forging and working on inclusive social contracts might be the pathway for enhancing these other mechanisms. It's now my pleasure to give the floor to our next panelist, Dr. Luca Koal, who is Professor of Practice, Africa Center for Strategic Study, National University, National Defense University in Washington, D.C., and Associate Professor, University of Juba. You have the floor, Luca.
First, thank you very much, and for you and for the organizers for this timely event and to be part of this exercise. And I want to thank Erin and her team for the quality research. But also equally important for including South Sudan to be part of the 11 case studies, because South Sudan, and I will talk more about it. But let me just say that the views that I will be presenting here will be my own views and not necessarily representing the views of the institutions I'm affiliated with. I know some of you are aware of South Sudan, but just let me give you some very basic facts in relation to this important topic. Before its independence in 2011, South Sudan experienced two civil wars when it was within the United Sudan. But it had also, within less than 2.5 years, entered into civil war in 2013 up to now. Well, and it has had also 3 peace agreements, 1972, 2005, and 2015. So there's no other example that you can check this issue of social contract like South Sudan. So currently now South Sudan is when its independence came, it was received with optimism, as especially the civility that people of Southern Sudan showed during the referendum and the immense support, regional, international. But also some people raise a mixed feeling. Maybe it is a state that has been born before, it is failed before its birth. Some of analysts, and it seems to be, now, it is the most fragile country in the world. It is the one of the countries having the highest population of forced displacement and food insecure. Then the question is this: such fragility is definitely a result of misrule by the elites. But I think equally important is good intention by the international actors that to a certain degree I could say less informed about the political marketplace and the drivers of social contract. And I think, and that's the idea why we wanted to talk about the issue of South Sudan. As Erin said, then why social contract lens to look at the issue of South Sudan? And it is very important for people, especially those who have a good intention to help the people of South Sudan, to ask the very fundamental question, what went wrong? But importantly also, South Sudan is so unique, the transition to statehood and the constitutional making, and also the construct of a state itself and the formation of nation. And it is very important for us, as mentioned by Erin, whether we should use different lens to look at these issues of state building and state formation from the construct of the social contract. And this is what I am attempting to do with this case study. Definitely fragility is, as mentioned earlier, is about ensuring legitimacy, state-citizen relationship, but equally important about the institution, but even delivering sustainable livelihoods and also social cohesion and justice. And it is very important to highlight the issue of justice. I don't want to bother you about because you will get the case study, but I want to share with you the key findings. And this case study is based on a field work, but also my personal engagement during the process of this transition to all these peace agreements, and to a certain degree, I'm becoming affected by discussing some of these issues in South Sudan. But this is my take of the main findings from this, based on the lens of the social contract. That the ruling elites, the way they manage the transition to statehood, including the constitutional making process, resulted into the following. One, the process itself was so exclusive. It was led by one political party in isolation of the rest. And that would have been a good opportunity for South Sudanese to forge a new relationship with the new state. Second, and unlike other African countries that emerged out of colonialism, this idea of common enemy is not a sustainable glue for forging a social cohesion. South Sudan was anchoring its unity to how much they hate the Northern Sudan. But when that common enemy gone, then these tensions start surfacing. The other one, the transition to statehood resulted in a production of transition constitution that actually resulted in creating a unitary and autocratic system with excessive powers given to the president, undermining the check and balance in the institutions. And for me, instead of before independence, we were having a very clear system in the CPA Comprehensive Peace Agreement, whereby we have a decentralized system of government. We're having a very check and balance. But with the new state, they abandoned in the constitution all these aspects. But even the post-independent government was so one party with two ethnic groups, and especially in the security sector. And these institutions, they actually fail and even accentuate the core driver of conflict, like what Aaron said, and I will talk about these ones. The role of international community, international actors, good intention. I was involved at the early stage of the assessment mission with the World Bank, and I could see for the first time to see in a history the pledges of donors or actual matching with the actual the actual donation. A good intention. But what happened, international actors, without knowing, they contributed in not tailoring the assistance to enhance the driver of social contract. And in sometimes contributed in accentuating the core conflict issues. For example, I think Erin mentioned it, the state itself after the independence was dominated by one political party, two ethnic groups. And the idea is now to focus on investing at the national level to supply legitimacy with the assumption that that one will reach the citizen at door. In actual, what we were doing, you were supporting the patronage politics of the elites at the national level. And the moment that the national level cracked and the lower level is very weak, then you could see the fragility and now the conflict taking the ethnic lines. Security sector is actually well staffed by the SPLA, dominantly Dinka and Nuer. They were fighting at a certain stage during the conflict, and they formed these institutions of the security sector. And then people start focusing in reforming these institutions. In actual fact, you are strengthening the dominance of these ethnic groups. I am saying good intention, if it is not informed, could actually unknowingly result in creating unsustainable peace. Now, what are the options? What are the hope? And I just want to share with you the last peace agreement, 2015. And this peace agreement, for me, it provides a way to address some of the drivers of social contract as mentioned by Erin. But just briefly, maybe people differ in terms of the lack of political will, this political leadership, rather than the content. One, in terms of the design and inclusivity and responsiveness to the core conflict issues, I think this agreement, in terms of participation, it was quite an inclusive process. And it managed to reinstate the decentralized system of governance that can allow how to manage diversity. And it also restricts the power of the president. And the decision-making was done in such a way through the consensus rather than the dominance of one political parties. At the same time, it managed to produce inclusive and legitimate institutions with a lot of reform that are actually, the idea was to have this reform to help the relationship between the credible legitimacy, especially in the oil sector, because South Sudan is affected what I call the curse of oil. And these agreements managed to go seriously on how to ensure accountability and transparency, and also transforming the security sector. Social cohesion for the first time in most of the three agreements to address the past and to provide provision of how you nurture the social cohesion. For the first time, African Union to establish what is called hybrid court, the issue of justice. And it was, because it was based on the Commission of Inquiry that resulted African Union to take upon themselves the issue of justice. Now, but it suffers from this power-sharing formula, like the rest of the peace agreement, where you reward those with guns. And it is a difficult choice what to do with the elites. And the second one, it was too ambitious as well, especially its implementation matrix. key takeaways from case study of South Sudan. One, the mindset of ruling elites of Dinka in Juba is reflect the same mindset of Sudanese elites during the independence, whereby they despise diversity and the political patronage and the exclusion of others. My fear, if this mindset continues, I think South Sudan may face the same fate of Sudan, of disintegration. The revitalization that you are seeing now, initiated by the African Union, by the IGAD, may provide opportunity. To what level can you move away from this power-sharing formula to a formula that will allow to establish a very credible transitional government that can pave the way for a serious engaging with the citizens of South Sudan? For the international system, it is very important to refocus the conflict sensitivity analysis on this driver of social contract and on core conflict issues, because I think this has been missing in most of the analysis. Despite this bleak picture of South Sudan, I think South Sudan stands a better chance of putting itself on the path of social contract and addressing the core driver of what is lacking is the political leadership and visionary leadership. And thank you very much to be part of this framework that I believe can make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luca. Thank you. Very, very compelling way of looking at the trajectory of South Sudan from a social contract point of view, and particularly how it can perhaps help correct some of the deficits that you have mentioned. And thank you again for bringing back the issue of political leadership. And I think the messages to the international communities are very clear. We want to make sure that we don't unwittingly exacerbate what we're trying to fix. My pleasure now to give the floor to our next speaker, Yasmin.
Thanks, Yusuf. Before I begin, let me just mention that the case study of Bosnia and Herzegovina is covered by me and also by Professor Roberto Belloni from University of Trento, and I hope he's following through the live feed. Well, one of the reasons why Bosnia was chosen as a case study is because of the depth of intervention that happened in the country, especially in the first 10 years. This came actually out through the Dayton Peace Agreement and the establishment of the Office of the High Representative that was in charge of civilian oversight of civilian implementation of the contract. Particularly in the first 10 years, OHR, Office of the High Representative, was vested with so-called bond powers that enabled High Representative to remove officials that were democratically elected, also to pass laws, policies, and do all these things in order to sort of push implementation of the Dayton Peace Agreement forward. However, in 2006, as the international community was withdrawing and diminishing its role in the country, these cracks in the peace building in basically creation of social contract, a resilient social contract in the country started to appear, and Bosnia has, since 2006, actually been in a kind of a stalemate without much happening when it comes to creation of meaningful social contract. So what we can identify 22 years later, after the peace agreement was signed, is that we have two kinds of social contract: an elite social contract, which is mainly comprised of political elites, and in case of Bosnia, those are ethno-nationalist political elites. Then there are also business elites that are closely aligned with these ethno-nationalist elites, judiciary to some extent, civil society as well to some extent, and partly also segments of international community which have helped perpetuation of power when it comes to ethno-nationalist elites. Elite social contract maintains status quo. It actually exploits communal fears that existed were mostly created during the war and are persisting after the war. Through patronage, they also maintain control of their respective communities. But the underlying reason behind this elite social contract is mismanagement of economic resources to the advantage of a very small clique of people. On the other hand, we have identified also existence of everyday social contract. Ordinary citizens actually comprise and shape this kind of contract. They're trying to make sense and manage a social and economic environment that was disrupted by the war. They're sort of trying to make their ends meet because, as I will present later on, institutions are not meeting their needs. This elite social contract is actually only caring about the elites rather than the rest of society. A lot of people involved in this everyday social contract are actually made to cross interpersonal and intergroup differences, especially when it comes to divisions that exist in the country after the war. When it comes to drivers, especially the first driver number one, inclusive political settlements, the close that we have reached, gotten to the political settlement was a Dayton Peace Agreement, unfortunately. Paradoxically, the agreement was not actually preserved the unity of the country and also divided the country at the same time. So we have two administrative entities in the country, Dayton Peace Agreement, this political settlement that we have, also perpetuates a core conflict issue one, which is competing conceptions of territorial boundaries and loyalties, and also core conflict issue two, ethnically structured governance that was created by the Dayton Peace Agreement, which actually aids ethno-nationalists' grip to power over the last 22 years. So, for example, in Bosnia, if you take a look at the institutional structure, it's a country of 3.8 million of people. We have 5 presidents, 14 governments, 14 parliaments, and God knows how many administrative staff at municipal level. I'm only talking here about higher levels in the country. This unwieldy, bloated administrative apparatus also serves as an opportunity for ethno-nationalist elites to control employment, and the public sector is actually one of the biggest employers in the country. Despite the fact that there were many downsides, many negative sides of Dayton Peace Agreement, we have managed to identify some positive sides as well. So, for example, creation of the Constitutional Court of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is a hybrid institution because it's comprised of 2 judges from each of the major ethnic group, as well as 3 judges appointed by the European Court of Human Rights, is generally seen to be an institution that is passing decisions that are in favor of a majority of the population. So it actually stays away from this ethno-nationalist divisions that are in place in the country. When it comes to second driver, the inclusive, fair institutions, I can start by quoting one of the participants in a focus group that we held in central Bosnia, in town in central Bosnia, who said that wherever we turn, all the doors are closed for us, which I think really depicts the state of perception of performance of public institutions among the population in the country. This complex institutional structure created a lot of overlapping when it comes to competencies, especially when it comes to responsibilities for welfare. So what people did is they actually turned to their own network of connections, what we call stela, in order to provide services that are supposed to be delivered by these institutions. Forms of social and political protests also exist, and in 2014 we have witnessed one of the biggest protests in the country, where 5 governments, cantonal governments, have resigned as a result. But most importantly, citizens' councils were established as a result of these protests, which actually collected requests from entire country, from citizens of the entire country, and pass these requests to governments at different levels and to different branches of government. When it comes to social cohesion, the third driver, unfortunately, Bosnian nationality does not constitute an identity for a lot of population. So it's not building this vertical cohesion through this Bosnian nationality, and together with this poor performance of institutions, it actually hinders creation of vertical cohesion. when it comes to segments of horizontal social cohesion, they seem to be surviving, especially tradition of coexistence in Bosnia that we used to have before the war, especially when it comes to interethnic marriages, which are now rather low but are still happening. And there are quite a few examples of people from different ethnic groups and different parts of the country trying to cross these divisions that were created during the war and trying to actually restore some kind of social cohesion that existed in the country. Economy is playing quite an important role as well when it comes to cohesion, because, for example, in Bosnia recently, over the last 10 years, maybe we have a few companies that are hiring people from different ethnic backgrounds. So they provide workplace for a lot of people who, especially young people who grew up in mono-ethnic communities, and they provide a space where they can actually learn about people of different ethnic background, different ethnic groups in the country. Economy also has a negative side, as I have mentioned, that business elites are also part of this elite social contract, and we have really high employment in Bosnia, around 40% of unemployment in the countries, and in the country, and even higher when it comes to youth unemployment. So high unemployment also led to violation of workers' rights, and it is an issue that is actually shared across the population, across ethnic groups in the country, and some trade unions have started to play an important role here because they draw membership from all parts of the country, from all ethnic groups in the country, and provide some sort of social cohesion. Then also diaspora, which is really big when it comes to Bosnia, also can play an important role here through their investments, but also through pursuing or doing business in a way that is different from business elites in the country. And then I'm just going to finish by actually giving one of the sort of overall recommendations, especially when it comes to international actors in the country. We have actually mentioned quite a few in our policy paper, but one of the overarching is that international actors should encourage initiatives, especially grassroots initiatives, which can expose the links between political elites, business, judiciary, basically that can unravel this elite social contract and provide channels that the voice of these grassroots initiatives that are basically carrying the voice of majority of the population is heard, and that this everyday social contract that grassroots initiatives are also part of can be taken to a different level, to a new level, to a resilient national social contract in the country. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Yasmin, and thank you for this rather complex but realistic picture of the situation that you have studied. There are so many things that look desperate and not going in the way that could constitute a social contract, and yet there are positive elements that could be used as building blocks for a inclusive social contract. We are running out of time, so I'm going to cut I am one of the co-authors for Tunisia, so I'm going to cut it less than half, perhaps focusing on policy and what should be the role of international community at the bilateral and multilateral level with respect to Tunisia on the basis of the two paragraphs that I'm going to share with you about Tunisia. As you know, it has gone through a revolution, even though the state did deliver services, there were a lot of grievances, and there was little room for political participation. Several key initiatives post-revolutions can be viewed as illustrating the key drivers of a resilient social contracts struggling to make up a coherent whole. These include political and institutional reforms, mobilization of high-level inclusive national dialogues, a forward-looking constitution adopted by broad consensus, and multiple participatory mechanism to resolve difficult core conflict issues, all drawing on a deep and broad reservoir of social cohesion. And as Erin mentioned, despite appearances, Tunisia's experience goes against the grain of standard social contract theory that assumes there is a state partner that has been negotiated and formed consensually, and that the relationship is vertical and top-down. In Tunisia, social contract making started horizontally, where civil society for the first 3 years after the revolution was driving the change and was in the driver's seat. It's only recently, and more importantly, 2 years ago, that the state has become to be trusted and has become gradually a primus inter pares in the social contract making. What really constitutes the social contract in Tunisia, as we are experimenting with this framework, is the 2014 constitution. It is the social contract. Tunisia, nonetheless, faces many challenges that are testing the resilience of this social contracting experience. Until recently, one of them was security, but the biggest challenge is an emaciated economy and corruption amidst high unemployment that exceeds 12%. So what really Tunisia needs now is an economic social contract to ensure that this political gains are sustainable. So, and there are many, in our paper we mention a number of hopeful signs despite rather dim economic prospects. And I'll just mention one of them, which is a law that was adopted late last month called Tunisia Startup Nation, which creates an ecosystem for entrepreneurship to flourish. It's a unique law pushed by young entrepreneurs who finally realize they cannot expect everything from the state. So what does that mean in terms of, for the policy world, and particularly for Tunisia's partners, both at the bilateral and multilateral level, including the UN system? The first, as you have heard, do no harm. Do no harm in the way you prescribe standard remedies to push for structural reforms, however necessary they may be. Second, as you anxiously look for ways to strengthen the state, ensure that this does not put the onus on the state as the sole penholder of the social contract. Particularly when Tunisians, citizens, in various ways have demonstrated and declared that they are at least primus inter pares in this process. 3, in attempts to keep all kinds of isms, and our regions is full of them, as you can imagine, do not sacrifice on the altar of stability and security the oxygen that keeps voice alive and free. A voice that Tunisians have wrenched out of the jaws of the state. Without this oxygen, a resilient social contract is atrophied, as will Tunisia's progress. Finally, if there is an urge or need or anxiousness to help Tunisia, focus on what is working and not simply what is not working and needs fixing by outsiders. Tunisia's social contracting experience is a good starting point. A resilient social contract can help Tunisians manage peacefully many of the bitter legacies left behind by decades of predatory governance, generally tolerated by the very outsiders, some of whom are now anxious to help. So that is my quick take, curtailed, of things are positive. There was no civil war in Tunisia, unlike the other cases. And civil society is an important pillar, and essentially help is welcome, but should be motivated by the humility to listen for what's working and not simply what is missing. So we have, unfortunately, very little time left for question and answer. We can devote 5 to 10 minutes And if there are any people who would like to have the floor, please. So there is 1, 2, the gentleman with the blue shirt, and then the gentleman with the red shirt. Yes, sir, you have the floor.
So my name is Marco Donati. I work at DPKO. Thank you all. It was a really interesting presentation and debate. And there was something that has been puzzling me since the SG spoke about this idea of grassroots initiatives, the importance of leadership. And we were saying how important it is to start as early as possible with an inclusive political process. But in the aftermath of conflict, that's the hardest part. You don't have a space conducive for inclusivity because the parts that come to the negotiating table are not necessarily wishing to do that. So I was wondering, is there anything, first of all, is it true that in order to reach an early start on inclusive political processes, you need a strong and visionary leadership in the different cases that you've been looking at? And is there anything that hints to what kind of social dynamics produce visionary and strong leadership in these cases?
Thank you. And then if you could...
Roy Licklider, and it really follows up on this directly. I was aiming it in particular at South Sudan. If you've got a leadership, you walk into a situation, you're trying to end a civil war, you've got a leadership that is not inclusive, you know it's trouble, what do you do?
Thank you. No more? Good. So maybe we could start with you, Luca.
Yeah, I think this question of the post-conflict challenges and how best you can make sure an inclusive process, given those with the guns are the one taking the show. And especially in the question of South Sudan, one of the things that one would have wished, first, you need to deal with those with guns, these elites, because elites becoming a gatekeeper for you to even get the grassroots. So you have to deal with them. But you have to deal with them with the peace agreement. In South Sudan, what should have happened, it would have been good now to start with the national dialogue. I think the idea of national dialogue is very important. But it must be a genuine national dialogue. What is happening in South Sudan is that you have a government decided to undermine the very peace agreement and use a national dialogue to buy time. And it's not inclusive, it's not. And it's becoming the crisis, I think, let me move to now the question that you rightly put it, how to deal with such leaders. In the paper, I suggested the following. One, it is very important if genuinely the people of South Sudan, they are fed up with war, and then you have elites that are trying now to buy time, it's very important to focus on what are the leverages available at the regional level, and especially with IGAD. Because IGAD and the African Union Peace and Security Council, because if these leaders are becoming now the cause of human suffering, there must be an action. And one of them, it is very important, it's not US to say sanction or Troika. African Union, they need to really start considering a really target sanctions to these individuals. Second is this idea of justice. African Union took upon itself the Commission of Inquiry, of which there are some individuals are believed to have committed atrocities during war. In order to give them a disincentive, establish this hybrid court to start the process of indicting these people. It's not ICC, African Union, because this is their initiative. Third, the whole lot of due recognition. Because if a state start continuing to produce suffering to its own, becoming a cause of the suffering to its people, and that such a state could go for shortcuts like elections, it is absolutely very important to de-recognize such regimes and isolate them. But it must be an African initiative within the mechanism that they have. One of the things I know in African Union, especially its Act 4H, is talking about the situation, the circumstances whereby a grave situation that can allow the African Union to intervene in the member state. in situation of genocide, crimes against humanity, and the war crimes. Unlike the United Nations Security Council. So you have such a mechanism that are so advanced. These are the things need to be to be provoked and to be tested in such a country like South Sudan, exporting almost half of its population outside the country. And I don't know whether I have answered you or not, but let me stop here.
You want to address the issue of inclusiveness?
Thanks, Marco, for the question. Well, yes, I mean, when it comes to inclusiveness, it's usually those who have guns that are around the negotiating table. But one of the main criticisms when it comes to international interventions is also neglect or ignorance of culture and history of a certain country, in this case, Bosnia. So, for example, if you look at the governance in the country that was created by the Dayton Peace Agreement, it's mainly based around these ethnic issues, whereas Bosnia still has, I mean, at that time particularly, it had a lot of history of and tradition of coexistence that existed in the country. So the only view that came, that was present at the negotiating table was this ethno-nationalist view, and not other views were actually taken into consideration, unfortunately, and which is why we are stuck now 22 years later where we were basically in 1995. It's just that we don't have violence anymore. When it comes to social dynamics that produce leadership, I like to think that these new voices, these new grassroots initiatives that are coming up, propping up, especially after the protest in 2014, are actually moving the public debate onto issues that are shared across the ethnic spectrum in Bosnia. And hopefully that this refocusing of the debate, public debate, by telling people that they should pay attention on other issues rather than ethnicity and divisions that were imposed by the war, this will also produce some kind of leadership that will prop up at a certain point in time and perhaps take country to this resilient social contract that we are hoping is going to happen. But we'll see. I mean, they have just started. Basically, it's only been a few years since these people are out. But the things that they are doing are pretty important, and the things that they have done so far are pretty important. So I'm really hoping that they will actually be able to manage to create some kind of leadership in the future.
Thank you. Aaron, you have the last word before we close.
Okay, addressing what, again, is a very important question, and I think our cases really illustrate that the trajectory is actually greater inclusion in peace processes. I mean, we see this now in most countries in really profound ways. But again, I think our cases also illustrate that it's the failure to sustain that in important ways, right? So South Africa is a great example. Yemen, incredibly inclusive process with the national dialogue. Why did it fail? Well, our author argues that, you know, it wasn't sufficiently rooted in devolution and decentralization in the ways that it needed to be, and that those actors were not sufficiently at the table. So yes, lots of inclusion, but not necessarily the types of inclusion that would take it all the way home. Colombia, Somalia. I mean, Colombia's many eyes on Colombia, very exciting, much promise. Our author shows that there is some concern around, similarly to what happened in South Africa, right? That too many competing concessions, particularly around land and how those will be effectively managed through the institutional arrangements and processes and policies that are able to take forward the peace agreement. Somalia, ditto, although I will note that our author in Somalia, what I was referring to earlier, is now Minister of Inclusion and Gender, I think it is. So yes, social dynamics do lead to the relationship with leadership. And lastly, on Zimbabwe, the case that I worked on as well, I lived in Zimbabwe 4 years, and I'm the second author to a national co-author, Showers Mowoa. And there, I think, too, you know, we've just seen a historic coup and societal protests to support that, which is a really important, momentous movement in Zimbabwe. And because people have been really afraid to protest for a very long time. But we also have concerns that, you know, the immediate response should not necessarily be elections in our view, right? But that it should actually be ensuring the implementation of the Constitution, which was voted in by 98% of the population, right? So that is a way to get to this, these mechanisms being, these institutional arrangements actually taking forward the things that represent what the people want and bringing together the everyday and the elite in really important ways. So last word is just I would like to also thank my team, again, the wonderful co-authors, but also Becky Hollander and Gabrielle Belli, my New York team, researcher and social media. Thank you.
Well, we're coming to the end. Let me just leave you with a thought. But perhaps to answer your question, there are certain things in life that can be taken, others have to be given, they cannot be taken. Inclusion has to be taken. In my case, inclusive leadership is an oxymoron. It doesn't exist. And that's why we had a revolution, is because it was not willingly given. It had to be taken. Most rights tend to be that way, unfortunately, but inclusion is one of them. So here is the thought I want to leave with you. The next time someone triumphantly brandishes a political settlement for ending a conflict and claiming it lays the foundation for sustaining peace, ask whether it contains drivers for forging a resilient social contract. And if you are met with a puzzled look, point to a global social contract for inspiration. This global social contract is called the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Peace. Why? Because peace is both an enabler and an outcome. And its full implementation requires the leadership of both the states and the citizens. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being patient. Please join me in thanking our panelists.